Welcome everyone to today's webinar, the CDM regulations, what FMs need to know. My name's Sarah. I am chair of IWFM Midlands Committee. I do this role in a volunteer capacity, and I am also National Facilities Manager for Maritime Transport in my day job. So just by way of introductions for today, please can you keep all conversations, questions to the chat and Q&A function. We will be going through Q&As at the very end of the webinar. So list them all as they come in, pop into your head per slide, etc. And we'll try our best to go through as many as possible. If we can't go through all of them by the end of the webinar, because we do have a hard stop at 1:30, then we will review all of the Qs so that we can provide As along with the slides at the end of the session. So just gone through the timings. We will have a hard stop at 1:30. Appreciate that everyone's really busy. So as I mentioned, I'm chair of IWFM Midlands Committee. Bill, who is our facilitator today, he will be going through everything to do with CDM and how it applies to facilities management and ourselves as managers, is our treasurer for IWFM Midlands Committee, and also he has dual hats. He sits on the People Development SIG as a committee member there as well. So just a quick about IWFM Midlands. We basically go through loads of different content throughout the years, and these can be through webinars. We are very active on LinkedIn. We recently attended the workplace event at the NEC last week, so there was now an opportunity. Some of you may have met us last week, and we also hold a lot of in-person events throughout the year. So just on that topic, if you want to keep an eye on everything that we do within the Midlands, then you can request to be part of the IWFM Midlands group on LinkedIn, and you can follow us individually as well. You can follow myself and Bill. We post a lot of our content. We post a lot about our events on there. So that's the best way to keep in contact with us. However, you can also go onto the IWFM event page and you'll see everything listed as it comes up there. But we do a lot of promotion through LinkedIn, so that's a good way to keep an eye on things. If you're interested in volunteering with us, if you reach out to the community's email, they will tell you everything that's involved, and we have various openings within the committee. We only have about 6 of us on the committee at the moment, so we're very tight, and we're always on the lookout for new volunteers. So if you're keen to get involved in putting on events, maybe writing a white paper, etc., then please do reach out to us. There's plenty of information and resources on our website, IWFM website as well, which I'll go through in a moment. This event, as you may have guessed, is in collaboration with our People Development SIG. So our People Development SIG chair, Helen, is on the call, and she's keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A section for us as well. And she'll, if there's anything pertinent that comes up, she will mention that. So do pop in your queries in the chat function.
Sorry, your slides have dropped off.
Oh, have they?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Okay. Yes, I see that. Bear with me. Are we back on? Perfect. Thanks, Helen. And that was Helen. That was very aptly timed. I did that on purpose so that Helen could just say, hey, I'm Helen. So Helen is our chair for PD SIG. There's also Bill, who I mentioned, obviously, is leading this session today. And we've got a couple of other members within the People Dev SIG as well. There's a LinkedIn group And there's also an email that you can contact People Dev with. If you scan any of those QR codes, that will take you through to a page on IWFM's site about People Dev, and also the LinkedIn group page as well. There are roles available also on the People Development SIG that we're looking for. There's deputy chair, secretary, and committee members. So you don't have to be a specific role. You can just get involved as a committee member as well. Hopefully it's going to work. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so a little bit about becoming a volunteer. What does it involve as a committee member? I've briefly gone over that. There's webinars that we hold periodically throughout the year that will explain in detail. You get the opportunity to meet people as well with it who are currently actively volunteering, like myself, Helen, and Bill. You can go through our community groups to volunteer. You can both from a regional perspective, and there's various specialist interest groups and networks that you can volunteer with too. As I mentioned earlier, if you email communities@iwfm.org.uk, you'll find out more. You'll be able to get an info pack, etc. So something really exciting, I've literally within the past hour or so posted something on LinkedIn about IWFM Live. Now, if you scan that QR code, it will tell you a little bit more about the IWFM Live, which is June 16th this year. It is the first event of its kind, and you'll see from the lineup, really, really exciting lineup. I won't dwell too much on the detail so that we can get into the session. But do scan that and take a look at the post on LinkedIn as well. On the 15th of July, again, myself, Midlands and People Dev are collaborating for a summer conference, which is about building FM leaders for tomorrow. It's a really exciting event. There's excellent lineup and panel speaker sessions. There's lots of interactive sessions within that, and there will be a CPD code to that day, like it is to this day as well. There's a save the date for the 22nd of June for our next in-person event as well, which is that biodiversity in the workplace. That's at Nuneaton. So keep your eyes peeled for bookings for both. Okay, we do a lot within IWFM to support you as a member. I won't go through all of these because I'm very aware that I've been speaking for 10 minutes now. But if you wanted to take a note of that QR code or just take a screenshot of that slide, it just gives you a little bit of context about what we do to support you as a member and what your membership brings you each year. So with that in mind, without further ado, I shall hand over to Bill to commence this day's CPD. Bill.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Lunch and Learn event that hopefully you'll get some useful information out of. I hope you're all settled down with a well-deserved break with a cuppa and a sandwich. And I do understand that some people may well have to leave the call a little bit early if you've got to get back to work or whatever. The good news is that the slide pack is going to be sent out by IWFM to all people who attend the call, and it'll also be available on YouTube as well as a link. And for those that go early, there'll also be a CPD link at the bottom that for those that are still on the call, then it's still, you'll be able to pick that up and scan it. For those that have gone early, you'll be able to pick it up off the slide pack later. So today's topic, the Construction Design and Management Regulations, which were last updated in 2015. What has this really to do with FM is the first question that a lot of people think. Because if we think of the CDM regulations, I think we all think of nice big house building projects, lots of high risk activities around working at height, and excavators, diggers, all sorts of high risk activity hazards that we'll be aware of. But there is actually a link in, or there can be a link into FM services work as well that's quite often hidden away and not really very evident, because we all think CDM, that's construction. But it's all around what is the definition of construction, really, that we need to just look at in a little bit of detail and just look for ourselves as to whether it might affect some of the activities we do, either as a client or a tenant or as an FM provider providing services on site. The CDM regulations actually are mainly also looking at how you plan and deliver activities. So where these do come into place, it's there for a very good reason. And the very good reason is, and we'll look at some of those issues as we go down it, that although we might think, well, it's not got as many problems as doing main construction, but I think you'll find some of the activities are still regarded as being, you know, things that have to be very carefully managed when we do them. So next slide, please, Sarah. So what we've got here is we've pulled out an extract over the next two slides to help to explain what construction work is into the CDM regs. And so we're not ploughing through lots of text. I've highlighted there what the definition of construction is. So it talks about alteration, conversion, fitting out, commissioning, renovation, repair, upkeep, redecoration, and other maintenance. So very important straight away to latch on to those areas, because I think they are the things really that, you know, could involve potentially what we do in the FM world. So next slide, please, Sarah. And to back that up, the other part of the definition, and this is probably even more important, it defines a little bit deeper now the installation, the commissioning, the maintenance or repair and removal of mechanical, electrical, gas, compressed air, hydraulic telecoms, computer systems as well, and so when we're doing IT stuff can be involved potentially, and also the very important line I think that's on the bottom there, which are normally fixed within a structure, and we'll talk a little about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So before everybody gets really panicky and worried, and we ask the question, does CDM apply to all maintenance work? There's a very clear answer to that, and that is no. So general maintenance work that we do is not classed as being part of CDM. You know, it absolutely is very clear that the definition of maintenance work hasn't changed in CDM from previous 2007 versions of the regulations. And what the advice says is if the task in hand looks like construction work, requires construction skills or construction materials, it probably is construction work. But general maintenance to your fixed plant that involves things that you would do routinely, like mechanical adjustments, replacing parts on plant, lubrication, are very unlikely to be classed as construction work. So this isn't designed to look at everything you do in the FM world and make sure that, you know, there's all sorts of additional requirements that you have to do in terms of safety regulations. You know, routine general maintenance is not part of CDM. That is part of your general health and safety work that you do, your risk assessments, you know, PURE and LOLA and other regulations come into play on a lot of those. But the other thing that's really important here is where something is construction work, you know, what you need to do to manage that is got to be proportionate to what you're doing. So smaller jobs, for example, simple, short, proportionate assessment of the risk should be carried out. So any planning and everything should be appropriate to the job. And it doesn't mean you have to do a massive construction phase plan for, you know, that you do on a housing estate for if you're just changing out a heating pump, you know, in a building and its heating system. That's not what's designed around this. And it's not what's meant. It's meant to be very proportionate to what you're doing and just look at the very specific risks that you've got around that work. So let's look at some typical activities and then a couple of examples I've put down, so to try and get this into some sort of context. So we mentioned general maintenance of fixed plant, which involves mechanical adjustments, mentioned that earlier, not part of CDM. So CDM applies to all construction work as per the definition that we were looking at a couple of slides ago. And we'll talk about HSE notifiable works and work involving more than one contractor later. So if it's construction work, CDM rules do apply, but there is a couple of add-ons, if it does, that we need to just consider that we'll talk about shortly. However, if your FM contract that you've got, and I know a number of them do, involves a provision of some project activities for the client, and clients watch out for this as well, you know, if your FM provider does some project work for you, then this very much is something you need to consider, because that project work in a lot of cases and refurbishments may start hitting some of those key points that were in the regulations. So I know a lot of FM contracts do include that provision, and it's then when you as a client or a tenant need to just look carefully with the FM provider at whether there's, you know, an applicability to CDM here, and manage it accordingly. So, you know, especially if they're going to be replacing fixed plant and equipment for you as part of that. Next slide, please, Sarah. So a couple of examples just to look at here. So I've just said here that if work involves the replacement, for example, of office furnishing, something you would think that's quite innocent really, and usually is, then CDM's unlikely to apply, I think we would generally say. However, if that work then extends to changing and modifying what I would describe as fixed assets, such as pipe work, you know, if you're having new kitchen units fitted, you're plumbing into the system, if your electrical wiring or you're having a new distribution board or something like that is on there, you know, that, or you've got hardwired assets that go straight into the system and are not plugged in, for example, then CDM will likely be applicable. So if you're just going in, changing desks, putting IT systems into floor routers and things like that, highly unlikely that that's a CDM issue. But if you're doing a bit more than that and you're actually starting to do things that involve the infrastructure of the building, however small, you need to start thinking about that. So in example 2, if you've got a piece of plant or equipment that's being routinely maintained, as we mentioned earlier, that's unlikely to be construction work because you're just maintaining it. You're just changing gaskets, servicing it, etc., whatever it may be. However, if that piece of equipment is being replaced, and I mentioned earlier, maybe, you know, a heating pump, for example, if in the electrical world, if you're replacing a distribution board or something like that, then it's pretty likely that CDM is going to be applicable. So it's that change and flip really between I'm maintaining it and I'm actually replacing a fixed asset within a building that is really important to understand with regards to this. And, you know, the CDM requirement to do planning on things is very important. But if it's a very small job, remember it needs to just be proportionate. So if you're changing quite a small pump and there's very little implication on that, then it's highly unlikely that you're going to need, you know, your plan will be quite small. You needn't go through a massive exercise of bureaucracy and also cost to manage that. That's something that people genuinely should be able to manage in terms of the risk. So if we get into a situation where CDM applies, so say we have got this distribution board that's being replaced, say we have got a pump that's being replaced, then we're getting into the world where there's some things that you really need to be aware of in terms of the CDM regulations. And they're quite a complex set of regulations. So nowhere near being able to go into the details around those regulations in a short session like this, but to touch on, the main things that you need to be aware of. So under the CDM regulations, where there is more than one contractor involved in the work, or it's reasonably foreseeable that you're going to have more than one contractor working on the project at any time, the client has a very clear responsibility. And by client, I think I'm saying here, the person who's employing the contractor and paying for that work to be done is probably the best nutshell description of that. Then it's the client's responsibility to appoint a couple of key people within that regulation. But this only applies if there's more than one contractor. I need to make that quite clear. So if you're just employing a single contractor to do a job, this part that we're talking about, not everything before, that's very clearly applicable, but for the appointment letters side of it, it's really important to know that from where you've got more than one contractor involved in the job, then the client needs to appoint a principal contractor, in other words, a contractor to, if you like, oversee all the activities of that work. And that will include all the other contractors that then do work for them and manage what they're doing in terms of the planning and the construction plan that you might do. The other key thing here is there's a need to appoint at that stage a principal designer. So this is somebody who has design control over the pre-construction phase, where you're doing all the planning and the risk assessments around what are the key risks here you need to manage, whether it be, bringing something up in a lift, up the stairways, are the lifts capable of lifting loads you've got to carry? Is it, how we need to isolate the services and any permits are just a couple of key examples. But I think you also need to consider tenants that may well be working on other floors and other parts of the building. So are there issues here around noise and dust, for example? Is your work, especially if it's electrical, for example, or even the water system, is that going to impose on your fire safety systems and start to cause a problem there that you're going to need to manage really carefully and plan for? And this is the whole essence of how you can still have quite a substantial risk doing certain types of FM activities that aren't necessarily building a new housing estate. So I've just put there a few follow-up lines on that around a designer with control over pre-construction phases, principal designer, a contractor to lead as principal contractor. And what you need to do is you need to be appointing these people formally and getting some form of response, even if it's an email return to say from the contractor. Lots of you who do contract work will be familiar with being appointed, particularly into principal contractor roles. I think what's really important about this is to understand that if the client doesn't appoint these roles, then if the HSE come charging in or there's an accident, they will go straight to the client, because under the regulations, you are responsible for the duties of the principal contractor and the principal designer. So it's a very short letter that I'm going to show you shortly when we move on in a minute. But it's very important, but very simple to appoint these people and get this in place, because otherwise, if you are a client, it does expose you to a considerable risk. So appointment letters, very important. So moving on down there, bear with me a tick. Okay. Right. So appointment of the principal designer and principal contractor. Yeah. So in FM work, there are, as we will all know, hundreds of different types of contracts that are let. But some contracts will quite clearly do, for example, design and build type scenarios. So the contractor may be responsible for doing your project for you, and it may well be part of that contract that they will both design and build. So if that's the case, it's not uncommon at all for, you know, who the principal contractor is, that organization will probably be the principal designer as well. And that's very common. Usually, if you get much larger projects, you know, you tend to find that the principal designer can be a number of people because of the mix of skills, but also they tend to be an independent person. But not uncommon in the FM world for design and build smaller scale projects for the contractors, many of you guys on the call, to be responsible for that need to be appointed by the client as both principal design and principal contractor. Next slide, please, sir. So what I've done here, and this is just for your information, lots of different ways of doing this, but I've just shown here an example of a typical letter and how simple it is that you know, a client would use to appoint, you know, in this case, a principal contractor. And apart from slightly different regulation, the principal designer appointment, you know, would look very much the same, but just be referencing slightly different regulations. But you know, that's how simple it is. It's not a complex thing, but you just need to get it acknowledged either in the minutes of a meeting or by a return email or something to say that the organisation's accepted that role. Next slide, please, Sarah. Okay, where this can get a little bit confusing, and part of the more complex areas of the regulations, is notification to the HSE of construction projects. So I would say for what we're talking about today in terms of FM projects, there isn't going to be a mass of these projects that will need to go on to the HSE website and fill in an online form, which is probably the best way of doing it these days, just to notify the HSE that there's CDM construction work going on. And you can see there the criteria, you know, involves quite a bit of work for it to fall into that type of criteria. This is not to be confused with the requirements, and often is, for CDM to be applicable on a job. That's purely done on that criteria we showed right at the start. Is it construction work? The notification process to the HSE is something completely different, but needs to be considered if you go over those thresholds or are likely to. But I think you need to understand why the HSE are doing this. So they, you know, one, they want to know where construction work is going on. Two, if anything goes wrong and there's an accident, it's easier for them to then track down and trace what they're talking about and who's in charge of it. And number three, of course, heaven forbid, if they actually want to come in and do an inspection of the work you carried on. You know, these days they're quite thin on the ground, so that's not too likely to happen in a lot of cases, the way things are going. But they just need that for information, and that's what they're doing, and they use it for their stats. And also, if they want to arrange to drop in and see, highly unlikely, but that's the idea of that. But that is just for the HSE's information. But you do need to do it if you're going into those thresholds of bigger jobs. Okay, so just switching back a bit to, you know, what's sensible about CDM being applicable to the type of FM work we've mentioned today, and what it's trying to achieve really, which is sensible planning of the work. You know, and this needn't be complex, as I've mentioned earlier. You know, it's just looking for you to manage those risks. So, you know, if you're doing work and you need to consider other tenants in a building, or you need to consider you're going to have to shut down part of the electrical system, and how's that, you know, who's in charge of that, who's holding the switch, master switch at the other end, organize your permits and all that type of thing, you know, and noise and dust, etc. Just as examples, but it's trying to make you sensibly plan that, not go over the top, not do a load of bureaucratic nightmares, but just do sensible things. So have the right people on the job at the right time. Even on the smallest of jobs, and particularly where you've got other people running around doing work that's nothing to do with what you've got, or even tenants running around doing things, that all needs to be managed properly to make sure we don't have these nasty situations where somebody accidentally gets involved or accidentally does things they shouldn't be doing because nobody talks to each other or knows what they're doing. And that's all about getting the right people around at the right time and managing what you're doing. So the other one is this cooperation and coordination, either with a landlord or whoever it is, to manage that power supply or the water supply or the fire systems. Really, really important that you take account of that, however small the job appears to be. And then having the right information about the risks. So you clearly want to know and realize what you're dealing with something. You know, are you putting something in place, but has it got some nasty chemicals that you need to be aware of and really take account of and manage properly when you're actually changing things? Is it a weight issue? Is it, you know, there can be all sorts of things. In older buildings, you've got the classics of asbestos and everything. So you need to have the right information about the risks, and then make sure that, you know, as the person carrying out the work, the principal contractor or the contractor, you know, you need to make sure that you plan and manage these works properly. Thanks, Sam. So I've got some slides actually that I'm going to sort of flash through some of these quite quickly in a minute, but I'm just going to touch here on some of the main duty holders that are within the regulations. I would suggest that then, as we're going to flick through a few of the slides and not spend too much time on them, that you know, you come back to these slides, or you actually take a little look at the guidance we're going to tell you about on CDM regulations at the end. So, as a number of you might know, not anything for anyone to get in, you know, too worried about if you're having some roof tiles changed or something. But you know, the domestic side of was brought into CDM. And of course, where that happens, it doesn't mean your elderly neighbour who lives on her own is somehow classed as a client under CDM. What it means is that the contractor coming in to do that work holds all of these responsibilities if it's a domestic job, and needs to make sure they're all managed. So before everybody gets quite frightened because they've just got some guys on the roof at the moment, it doesn't mean you're responsible for that at all. It means that they are under CDM now. I think it's trying to look at small builders. I'm not going to mention it, but I've got some small builders quite close on some houses near me who are probably not doing the best of things, shall we say, and I think we all see that. So small builders, they're trying to get to do things more properly, really, shall we say, but effectiveness of that, I think we'll all draw our own conclusions, probably not that brilliant in my experience. So it mentions domestic client. That's what that is, an individual who has work carried out on the home. Yeah, but you don't do any, you haven't got any duties. That's all managed and accepted by the HSE as a contractor. So you've got your commercial clients, you know, the people who are paying to have jobs done, either by an FM provider, separate contractor, or whatever. We mentioned that if there's more than one contractor involved on the job, that you then need to have a principal designer. That may well be your principal contractor. And in a lot of cases for smaller jobs, design and build jobs, that will be. But you need to just make sure you're absolutely clear on who does what. Designers, so one of the main things about CDM is you may well be changing a heat pump, whatever it is. So there'll be somebody who has a speciality in that area of work, but then there'll probably be, and there will be, of course, electrical connections to that. So designers, not always, of course, just one person. Depends what skills are needed, because you'll have different designers with different skill sets that will input into whatever you're planning and delivering. And the idea of the principal designer is, if there's more than one contractor, they coordinate that and pull it together for you. Designers we've mentioned. Principal contractors, same thing. If there's just one contractor, they're not known as a principal contractor under CDM, they're just a contractor. But if there's more than one, you need to appoint one who will be in charge of the area that you're looking at, and probably their subcontractors who will be coming in to do the work for them. They need to make sure that they manage them appropriately. Not your job to be on top of those and another contractor's subcontractor and manage them to the nth degree. That's their responsibility. You've just got this overview, and you may be an intelligent client that's got quite a skilled workforce on a big site that looks after things. Well, clearly you're going to want to make sure things are right on that. And of course the workers, and of course one that's not on there is just the people in the area, the tenants, etc. So I'm going to just dwell on the slides very briefly as we go through the next few, Sarah, if you want to move on. So this is giving you some detail in the slide of what the responsibilities of the various people are. Just to let people know who are more on the client side, that the actual putting in of an F10, if that's required, to the HSE does not have to be done by the client themselves. They can get either the principal designer or somebody else on their behalf to put that in. It doesn't have to come, and many clients do get other parties, particularly the principal designer, to do that for them. So there's some background here for you when you get the slides to go through, and it just brings out the main duties of some of these people that are involved. If we just move on to the next one, Sarah. Again, it's just running through the same set of people that we mentioned 2 slides ago, what they're responsible for and what they should be doing. Next slide, Sarah. So, pre-construction information. Sounds like, well, you're thinking, well, I'm changing something here. What pre-construction information might I need? Well, if it's an old site, I mean, you would hope that you would probably have a good handle of what you're doing if you're working in that area anyway, but who knows? There may be asbestos gaskets on something you're removing and changing. There may be, you need to have a schematic of the water system. There may be some sort of other risks involved in there, such as the strength of a floor or whatever it may be. This is all the sort of pre-planning work that somebody needs to look at. And where that's simple, it needs to remain simple. This is not, a job creation scheme where you need to go in madly, putting all sorts of major documents, and don't ever let anybody talk you into that is what's needed, because in most cases it's not. It's just sensible management and identification of what is going to be an issue to you to do the job. And that's what pre-construction information is. And quite often, a key role, if you've got more than one contractor, of the principal designer will look at a lot of this stuff and start to pull it into place for you. Next slide, please, Sarah. So we mentioned the construction phase plan. So if I'm building a big warehouse somewhere, you can imagine the construction phase plan is going to be really big, It's going to be really complex because you're going to have your groundworks or whatever it is, the early stages of what you're doing. Then there'll be your build, then there'll be your commissioning. The plan will change numerous times. It'll be goodness knows how thick. But if you are doing, a change of a single asset in a building, you need to consider what it says are the key factors in planning. But then, in some cases, it will be just a single or two sheet piece of paper looking at the key issues. And in the links at the end, there's a really good document on the construction phase plan that looks at, how you might lay these out and what's a good format for it if you've not dealt with that before. So it looks at those key issues we've mentioned there: planning, working together, organising, looking at the key hazards will be in there as well. Maybe design risk assessments if it's complex. Next slide, please, sir. So I mentioned through the call some really key documents that will help you. So whereas the CDM regulations, like most sets of regulations, are tedious legal speak, which is what they are really. And a lot of people would look at them, and even people who know a lot of safety stuff look at them and say, they're not really telling you much. So if you're not used to that sort of thing, they're not much use at all. But for most high risk activities, you either have some guidance or what they call an approved code of practice. Approved code of practice got a little bit more of legal standing. So for the CDM regs, there is an approved code of practice, ACOP L153, that goes through the regulations, but then also tells you how it is in sort of layman's terms rather than something that might be taken to court. So really useful document, that one. Goes into a lot of detail, and also because it's an ACOP, the way the legal system is that if you follow what an ACOP says, you're normally deemed to be complying with the law. Now, it doesn't mean you have to comply with it, but if you don't comply with it, you have to prove how you're doing it safely by doing another method. Guidance, a little bit different, doesn't hold that same thrust in terms of what the HSE look at. But ACOP, really good advice in there. Highly recommend anybody who needs to look at that. There's a quick guide for clients on CDM, the IND document, which is quite shorter and more succinct in terms of telling people what they need to know. There's guidance on the construction phase plan that's available on the HSE website. That's a really good document if you want to understand what a construction phase plan is like. And then also, of course, just to mention, easy to go online, do a bit of a Google search for F10 notifications and how you do it, which is quite a simple online exercise these days. Next slide, please, sir. So more guidance documents for you. I think it's really, really helpful to look at any of these documents just to enhance your knowledge if you think you might be involved with this sort of stuff. But that's just a little bit of an extra. Next slide, please, Sarah. Right. So IWFM have produced, not exactly aligned to what we're talking about, but it links into this, a couple of really good notes here that it'd be quite useful for you to scan the code if you're interested. So really good document here on fire safety management and safety management systems that you might want to just grab those QR codes on. Fire safety management good practice. So that's really, really handy documents they are. Okay, and then just to give a little bit of a push at the end here, you know, there's lots and lots of training that goes on, as well as the sort of lunch and learns like this one within IWFM. So please look on the IWFM website and look at any, you know, training gaps you feel you might have, and all sorts of areas aligned to this and other subjects, because there's some really good stuff there as well. Next slide, please, Sarah. Most importantly of all, for all of you on the call, please make sure, and we'll leave that up for a minute or so, for you to scan this, because so important to keep your CPD up to date as FM professionals. And events like this, of course, give you the opportunity to record your CPD, which is really helpful. So we'll perhaps leave that on the screen, Sarah, for a little bit. And if it's okay, we'll go to Helen or yourself, I'm not sure who was going to man the pumps, to just see whether there's one or two interesting questions come up that we've just got probably 10 minutes to start to look at.
We do indeed, yeah. We've got 10 minutes to go through some Q&A, so please feel free to keep on bobbing in some questions or queries that have popped into your brain since during the call. So yes, we do have a few. So we've got one from Charles. To appoint, obviously, to appoint a principal designer will involve a significant quantity of extra work. Are there any guidelines as to charging additional charges and fees, etc.? Say a percentage of 2%, and unexpected extra cost, as an unexpected cost to the client. Not really wording it that way, but very well. But hopefully you get our gist there of what the question is. So
a little bit difficult, Charles, to give a definitive answer on that, because of course it would depend completely on what are the complexity of the piece of work you're doing. So you know, that is going to be a governing factor, really. I would suggest that the actual appointment part, you know, if it is fairly simple piece of work, particularly if you are getting your FM provider to carry out that work, then in a lot of cases, I've seen people go to the FM provider and say, look, you know, you've given us a quote on this job. It involves yourselves and 2 of your other subcontractors. We clearly need to have a principal designer involved. This is assuming it's not within your contract within the FM provider already, Charles. If it is, obviously that's done and dusted, that they will do that, you know, within the provisions of the contract. But if not, you can approach them, I would suggest, might be the most cost-effective method. Larger organisations, of course, and, you know, you're getting into really big organisations, sometimes have people, if they're fairly non-specialist skills, within their own organisation who do principal contractor stuff. Or there's a lot of companies out there, consultancies, who will do principal contractor work for you. Should this cost an arm and a leg? If it's a simple task, absolutely not. And it's probably better off done by the contractor. If it's a more complex piece of work, then yes, there may be some additional cost involved that you need to factor in, you know, when you're doing the planning phase and getting, I guess, approval for your project costs. In other words, don't get caught out that you're actually you've missed out something important that's a cost. And this is one important thing you need to consider about these factors. Hope that helps.
Yes, that's great. Thanks, Bill. How far in advance does F10, this is a very good question, how far in advance does an F10 need to be submitted?
Right. So if you're doing a planning phase of a work, and it's quite clear that it's going to go over that criteria, as soon as you know your key people are doing the job, so you'll know who the client is, as soon as you know who your principal designer is and your principal contractor, then the advice is that as early as possible, you get this in. But in all cases, this should be in before work starts. So you need to definitely do it before anybody puts a spade in the ground or starts unbolting and changing something. But generally speaking, you need to, it's something that in your early stages of planning the job, you can probably have a good stab at how many hours that you're being quoted from your contractors, and see whether this is something where you're then going to have to get, usually either yourselves if you've got a health and safety team, or the principal designer to just fill in what is a very simple online form to tell them. Whenever I've done them, I've never actually ever had anything back. It just disappears in there and you never hear anymore. It's purely so they've got it logged and they don't want anybody, shall we say, running under the radar.
So, sorry, Bill, are you saying that would the client or maybe the principal contractor, depending on who's submitting it, would they receive a confirmation that it's been received?
No, so once you do the F10, which is a client responsibility, so if you are the client, so I'm not talking principal contract here, unless for some reason they've been asked and agreed to put this in online. If the client or the principal designer, whoever that is, and that may be the contractor, as we said earlier, for a small job, once that's in, that's it. You don't have to, you just get acknowledgement it's been done. I mean, a lot of people take off a print or a copy just to hold in the files or probably display on site, which is always preferable. But, you know, you don't need to start confirming things and other things. It's an automated system now that goes automatically online, and you'll get an acknowledgement from the HSE that it's been done and put in, and that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Question from Dana. I do apologise if I've said that name wrong. When unsure on whether to, when you're unsure if a project falls under CDM regulations, where's a good place or resource to reference, to seek advice, or, you know, to check actually, does it hit all these boxes or not? So
sorry, you're breaking up a little bit on my line, Sarah. I don't know whether everybody else has got that, but can you just repeat that for me? Sorry.
Yeah, so if we're unsure if a project falls within CDM or not, so it's maybe a little bit of a grey area, is that a good place to reference or resource or contact to just verify, does this specific project fall within CDM?
Yeah, so I would expect for all organisations, and particularly in this day and age, that it's something you would need to go through whoever is your competent health and safety advice. So for a lot of people, that will be, you know, their health and safety manager if you work in a, you know, large to medium-sized organisation. If you're a very small organisation and you haven't got that sort of infrastructure, or if you need it, you would probably call off a consultant, you know, then you would probably just, and it shouldn't cost you an arm and a leg, just get a competent advice as to whether you think that this work falls within that criteria. I would say that in a lot of cases, if you're employing a contractor, particularly if they're a large company, large FM company, for example, then they are going to have a good idea whether the work, because they'll have done it probably 100 times before, falls under a CDM criteria or not. So also, if you've got a good relationship, which hopefully you will have with your service provider, FM company, contractor, then you would probably just say, I'm not quite sure about this. Do you think this falls under there? Because they'll almost certainly have a health and safety manager that you can help. It's not a trick question. It's not something contractors are going to, you know, make a lot of money out of if you suddenly find that, you know, it's CDMable. It's just to make sure you are doing the right thing and protect yourselves and everyone involved in the project.
Great, thanks, Bill. Just a couple more questions whilst we've got the time. One from James. Can you have two contractors on site if they're working on different elements, different asset types, and areas, different areas of the building, without needing to appoint a principal contractor?
Right, so it depends. If they are completely unlinked pieces of work, so I don't know, if you got somebody fixing some aerials on the roof, and then down in the basement you've got somebody, changing a clarifier or something, then, and they're completely separate bits of work that you're paying for separately, it's a different contract, then there's no link between them. If you are doing a piece of work where you're getting some electrical changes to take place in one part of the building, for something you're doing as part of the same project, fitting a new piece of equipment, and they're linked, then they are both part of that CDM project. In other words, it's this link between who's employing who. Is this on a separate contract? Because the one thing the HSE don't like is where people are trying to deceive them a bit by splitting jobs off to try and avoid it being CDMable. But when you stop and think, it's more based on the type of work you're doing rather than, shall we say, who's doing it. Then you need to focus on that criterion. Is it part of it? And if you are employing that as the part of the same contract to do the same piece of work, then even if they're working devoid of each other, they need to all be considered together because they're linked naturally. They're going to be interfacing with each other. If they're not interfacing with each other and they're doing separate pieces of work in the building, normal FM work going on while there's someone doing a CDMable piece of work somewhere, then absolutely no.
Great stuff. 1 minute. So I think this one's going to be quick because we do have one that might be a bit more detailed, which is any advice on managing construction phase plans for high volume reactive repair call outs. I don't know whether that's going to be relevant because it's reactive repairs, because usually reactive repairs, that wouldn't be CDMable.
No.
But I think it depends.
I'm going to take a guess here, and whoever it is, please come back and say, either by contacting me, on LinkedIn or whatever, or through the Q&A, and we'll pick them up. But there is something that a lot of organisations do now. So particularly big organisations, if you've got an FM contract in place that includes doing these sort of small projects and that type of thing. So call this running maintenance if you like, or whatever it is. What they do is they will appoint that contractor as their principal contractor for all stuff that's done within their contract. So now that's okay. Where you have to be careful is that because the HSE very much dislike blanket appointments, because there's all sorts of risks involved that clearly you don't want the people without the specialist skills doing things they shouldn't be doing. So depending what your contract's written like, if it's a quite straightforward SFG 20 type repair contract, then nothing to stop the client going to the FM provider and saying, I'm appointing you, where we start to go into CDM as our principal contractor. And if they do the design and build bit for minor stuff, probably principal designer. That's a little bit more contentious because there's clearly specialist elements of design that can cross over. If in doubt, and you think something's more complex and outside of an FM contract provisions, and you're sort of going outside of that, you are best advised to appoint for that very specific task for both a principal contractor and a principal designer.
Great stuff, great stuff. So we are slightly over by 2 minutes. There's a couple of more questions. Bill, did you want to review those questions that we've got outstanding at
I think
and complete and share with the
I will do.
slides? Yeah, great stuff.
I think it's because I don't want to delay. Obviously, people are starting to drop off and people might miss it. So yeah, I think. But thank you very much, everyone, for your attention, and I hope it's been helpful.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for leading on this. It's really interesting and worthwhile to know about all of these elements from an FM perspective, because there are obviously situations that we would come into as facilities managers that we would need to know about this aspect of and this regulation. So thank you so much for your time. Great feedback as well in the Q&A, so thanks to everybody who's putting feedback in there as well about the session. Really valuable session. So there's a couple, if people are still on, who has asked this question: how should what qualifications sorry, this is a question for yourself, Bill, so I'm missing it now. There was somebody who asked a question, and I think that's why it's disappeared. Helen has responded to it about
okay, that's great.
So we'll respond to all of these, send them out with the slide deck, so your question won't be missed. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining today. And
thanks everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.